Hello and welcome back to the Writing Diary. My name is Tiia, and I am a neurodivergent writer who took a long break from writing and is now back trying to understand what has changed and how to be a professional writer again. This podcast is my self-reflection on topics that help but also challenge me. And today we are talking about a challenging topic, and that's how to create and write while the world is basically on fire. How does one keep the creative spark alive? So please grab a hot beverage of your choice and let's talk about it. And thank you, by the way, for sticking around the last episode of the podcast. I'm feeling much better now, even though I still feel the plague in my bones, but it's only going up from here. But now, what about writing when the world is in a crisis? My writing journey started again last year. I began in February 2024, right after my birthday, with journaling and writing poetry again. And then in summer and autumn, I thrived. Autumn is my favorite season, so I fully felt myself and embraced it by letting my creativity flow. I wrote short stories, poems, and experimented a lot, and I was in love with life, and it was like flowing through my veins, unlike the many years before. I was alive. And then November hit, the elections in the USA happened, and suddenly a feeling of pending doom was building up within me. And the foreshadowing that this doesn't mean anything good, and we're about to live through yet another historical event like we did in the past few years, was very realistic, and I hate that I was right. January, the inauguration of Trump became a horrendous preview of what we would have to deal with in 2025. Feeling like being thrown back into 1933, having the same discussions, the same movements, and the same sentiments, and that was terrifying and frustrating me, especially as a German. It used so much of my energy trying to inform, explain, and warn. And now it's April, and I feel burnt out and jaded at the same time. More than once I wondered, why should I now write when everything feels so insignificant at the moment? My poetry has stalled not because I didn't want to write, I couldn't. The feeling that drove my inspiration, killed by a feeling of everything ending soon. Why does it matter writing about love when everyone is hurting? I don't want to mock anyone in pain, with a deep-rooted fear about their own existence. In one poem, I wrote about it with the lines, "To love, to connect, is to hold a seed unplanted. Knowing the soil is poisoned, the sun obscured, how can I nurture something that would not bloom when the frost is on the doorstep waiting to claim it all?" And while this is in a different context of falling in love and making meaningful connections, it's the same core problem, the same feeling. The inability to look into the future, to plan and create a future when everything you know now shows you there might not be a future worth living for. But then I also got mad at other writers and artists who did not acknowledge the situation we're in right now and who continued their life as if nothing has happened. How could one be so ignorant? How could not everyone stop everything they are doing to focus on fixing the situation? How are people pretending that it's just not that bad? I heard people say that being an artist, being a creative is important right now, but for me it felt wrong, it felt impossible. Why did I feel so negative about my own work and position? And I think in some way we're experiencing survivor's guilt, the guilt of being able to create and to remove ourselves from the horrors of the world and have the space to make something different. We feel guilt because we don't think we deserve that spot when others are suffering. And it's a deep human emotion when you have empathy. We do not want to seem out of touch with reality or ignorant to the problems that exist in the world, but we also don't have a direct influence on how to change things. It's a trap that needs to be understood and destroyed, and I will, for my own sake as well, look into it and find ways how to handle being a creator in times of crisis. Because self-destruction and the loss of one's ambition does not fix the problem. Oppressive systems thrive on despair and overwhelm. They bombard you with horrible news and announcements. They try to be the water that erodes the stone until there's nothing left but fine sand. But they fear one thing: the people who can't be oppressed. Escaping despair and overwhelm is the key to removing yourself from the horror spiral. And one solution to escape the overwhelm is to choose joy and happiness. And I know this now sounds like some cheesy self-help advice, but we can trick our brains into letting go of negativity, even if it's just for a little while. Because the same way exposure to negativity can change our thought patterns into negative, it's possible to do the opposite. And that has nothing to do with ignorance, quite the opposite actually. See, our body produces cortisol when we are stressed and anxious. It makes us hyper-aware and helps us to stay alert in moments of danger. Our body doesn't do anything wrong by doing this. But when the threat is a lingering fear that does not pass but stays around for weeks and months and is, like in this case, constructed to manipulate us, to keep us anxious and petrified, then the cortisol will make us sick. And that is not helpful. Taking breaks from the worldly despair isn't ignorance, it is self-care. And if we look into the rich cultural expression of minorities, especially minorities with a history of oppression, then we can see this in full action. Pulling yourself out of the passive role of the person that is acted upon to become the person acting, it is an act of liberation that in writing not only affects the reader, but just as much the writer itself. And not all of our stories in written word needs to be about the crisis. While you can, like I do now, process these things through your work, the world is multifaceted. There is enough space for work that raises awareness and work that helps those who need it to escape from the dread of the world for a while and recharge their energy. And escapism is not neglect, it's a survival strategy that gives us the strength to come back stronger, more focused and more grounded. Because one thing that always needs to be taken into consideration is that fighting against oppression needs to have a goal, a motivation. If you have nothing to fight for, why fighting? But if you, as a writer, create stories and worlds and scenarios of hope, then this hope manifests in people, and they will crave the freedom and the peace. There's a reason why writers are usually the first who are censored by authoritarian governments, why books get banned, why journalism gets censored and controlled. The written word is a strong weapon, and it's important for humanity. Also, never underestimate the power of small personal anecdotes and stories. Writing a poem about a childhood memory can wake emotions and the drive to preserve peace just as much as an anthem of resistance. The fact that we need escapism is not only a theoretical concept. We have examples for this. Hollywood, for example, changed and reshaped during the Great Depression between 1929 and 1939 extremely. And while Hollywood was struck by economic struggles just like any other industry, during that time some of the most iconic movies and musicals were written and filmed. For example, The Wizard of Oz. Stars that we now connect to the glamorous Hollywood of the past found their place during this time. People would, despite hardships, save money to see their weekly movies, to have an hour or two in which they didn't have to worry. Movies with social commentary shaped the society. The animated color movie The Three Little Pigs by Disney came out in 1933 and is said to be an allegory to the struggles of people in that time. The pigs seen as the common people, while the big bad wolf represented the Great Depression. The movie became a hit and was shown for many months, and the song Who is Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf became an anthem for the Great Depression. Going to the UK, Agatha Christie wrote many of her most successful stories during the Second World War while the bombs were falling. She decided to stay in her London flat, and while working in a pharmacy, she took her time finishing some of her best stories, keeping her and her readers alike sane and distracted from the war. But for her it was not only distraction, but also the fear of not surviving the war that drove her to finish stories and projects. But she would survive the war and continue publishing all the way into the 70s. Another war example, a tragic and sad one, is Anne Frank. Her diary entries during the war mix reflection on the world with thoughts of a teenager and an outlook into the future. Even though it being privately written, writing was something that kept her grounded and helped her processing the world around her. Her optimism for the future and humanity despite everything. Another outstanding example of hope during hardship. And even now, her diary is often cited during times of crisis. Jumping forward into 2020, the time the world locked down during COVID-19. The entertainment industry grew immensely. Live streaming, video games, movies, books. People were forced to stay at home, and distraction and entertainment were crucial for their well-being in isolation. And I was part of it as well. I streamed and uploaded hundreds of videos during the lockdown. I worked long hours, socialized and interacted with many people during that time. Many of my favorite online shows and streams happened during that time. Escapism was what everyone needed. And creators were the ones that provided it. But like I said in the beginning, the guilt is there. I know all of this. I know all about the importance of distraction, escapism, But I also know about the passiveness of our society to stand up for itself. The lack of efficacy when it comes to preserving the world for themselves and their children. And my biggest fear is that by providing distractions and escapism, I nurture that behavior. That I feed into this parallel reality in which nobody has to care about anything because it will eventually work out just fine. But then I wonder also, is it my responsibility? Do I need to parent people into doing the right thing? Is this a pressure I can put on myself despite everything? Or do I need to let go of this idea? I couldn't answer that. Do I help create bystanders, or is my work a fireproof shelter in a world that is burning? And I'm somehow now navigating the situation by splitting my content. Creating content like this and critical poems about our society to talk about and document what is happening, but also create positive and pretty things that help me grounding myself and others. And maybe that's the trick. Creating for myself in the first place and then shared with those who need it as an afterthought. Taking away the expectation of shaping the society, but letting readers participate in my own self-reflected shaping. As you can see, I do not have the ultimate answer myself. I'm struggling just as much as others do. Staying sane in these days is not easy, and I also don't want to pretend that it is. I might have chosen the worst or the best moment returning to writing, rediscovering a passion while uncertainty is our everyday lived experience. But there are some things that have helped me during the past few months. First, getting news from respected news sources only that report without fear-mongering. Next is muting and unfollowing those who fall for fear-mongering and reproduce it. Next is blocking everyone who generates fake news with AI, because we really do not need this right now. And then doing everything in my power to resist oppressive structures and voice my opinion when it is needed and warranted. And the last is not trying to be in the news circle 24/7, but giving myself time off. And I noticed especially with this that after 1 or 2 days of actively ignoring the news, my creative spark finds back to me. And in the end, I have to ask myself if the guilt that I'm feeling is an internal guilt because I feel like I'm not doing enough to change the situation, or if it's an external guilt that is put upon me. I need to remind myself of the purpose of my work and that art will always be a reflection of its time. Even art that is the opposite of the day-to-day experience in itself. It is a message and a reflection of the reality we live in. And also a reflection of what the people need in the time that we live in. The world doesn't just need warriors. It needs gardeners, it needs bakers, and it needs storytellers. And my joy is not a betrayal of the fight. It is the proof the fight is worth having. So let this become my mantra for the next years, because I surely will need it.